Morning. My name is Peter Wilson. I'm one of the information governance leads at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And today we're going to run a session regarding the information governance tender questions and answers and things to consider when you're undertaking your response to a tender. So just a couple of housekeeping points. As you've already been asked in the chat, if you could turn off your video cameras and your microphones are muted, that would be really helpful. If you have any questions about anything that I say, could you put them in the meeting chat, and then we can collate them into a document that we can then share to everyone and on the chest. Just to save duplication of questions, if you could like the questions in the chat instead of just asking this, reiterating the same question, that would be really good, because it means that the ones with the most likes are the ones that we need to focus on to make sure we get out a response. Okay. So why are we providing this training? So information governance questions in tenders are actually relatively new, and as a consequence may cause some confusion. It's only been an aspect, it's been part of the Data Protection Act to make sure that we look at appropriate security in relation to processors as well as joint controllers since 1998. But with the advent of GDPR in 2018, it became an explicit responsibility in relation to data processors that there are certain things that data controllers have to be aware of, and they were made clearly explicit, as well as what we have to put into the contracts. So, as a commissioner of services, whether you're a processor or a joint controller or a controller in your own right, the GMCA has a responsibility to support best practice and information rights in this area. So whatever we undertake, we will always, as an organisation, because we're spending public funds, make sure that the companies that we spend that money with respect the requirements of data protection and information rights and are putting in place the appropriate requirements and are following what's necessary. So to that effect, this session's focused on the tender question that would be used for the framework, but it can be applied to virtually any information governance question that you would come across. Just to say that this advice is based on reviewing many tender responses, and it might also be teaching you stuff that you already know, but it's stuff that I've come across and it's stuff that I've experienced multiple times, and therefore that's why I've raised it within this training session. So the points we're going to cover in this training session is understanding the question. What do we mean when we ask you certain things? When you're writing the response, how best to structure it. I can hear someone's phone going off, so could everyone please make sure they're on mute? Thank you. And in relation to any additional documentation that we require as part of that question, what it is you should be attaching. So just a quick point to frame what we're looking at when we ask the information governance question as part of the tender process. Information governance, it covers systems and process management, records management, data quality, data protection, and the controls needed to make sure that the information use is compliant as it states there. So that's quite a broad spectrum of things. That isn't just a limitation in respect of IT kit, so encrypted laptops and the like. It's a broader thing. It's looking at the processes, how you hold data, how your records management, how you make sure your data is kept up to date, and obviously then compliance with the data protection legislation. As it says there, the principles in relation to data protection compliance are in the GDPR and obviously the new Data Protection Act 2018, and potentially may have some implications when the Brexit UK GDPR comes into force next year. The difference between IT and IG is when you're considering information technology governance, you look at considering the process that makes sure effective and efficient use of IT kit. So making sure you have the appropriate software that people need, the systems will support the things that you need it to do, and obviously you're keeping all of that kit secure. So that means that the IT policies and procedures are part of your overall information governance approach, but it isn't solely the response to your information governance approach. And that's one of the things that we try and tease out as part of the IG question, that you understand what the data protection aspects and data protection responsibilities are of your organization, not just the fact that you're going to keep your IT kit secure and have a system that everyone likes using. So, as we say there, the question is about information governance. It will include aspects of IT, but is not solely about IT. So, breaking down the question. When we start the question, we ask you to describe the high-level governance controls, including responsibilities at board level, as well as your physical, personnel, procedural and technical controls that your organisation and external subcontractors you will use. So the key aspect of this with any question is to read it and try and understand what's being asked. As you can see within that question, there is an explicit point relating to the assignment of responsibilities at board level. So obviously that's something that you would be expected to respond to and not ignore. Obviously, there's the question is, what if we don't have a board? You know, not all organisations are structured in that way. Well, therefore, explain the structure of your organisation. If it is small, if you have trustees, whatever the structure of your organisation is, explain that, but then explain who and which individual and which role is responsible for what. And that's what we will be looking for. So if it's at a board level, we would be looking at a senior member of the board to have an actual responsibility for information governance and data protection, not just IT security, because that is a responsibility for IT, not overall data protection. So we would be looking to identify who, either at a board level or as an owner or a senior person within your organisation, has the responsibility for information governance, that is data protection compliance, in addition to the IT security. Looking at the high level governance controls, if you do have senior management, how do they work together to make sure the data protection requirements are in place? So if you do have an IT security manager and you have a data protection officer or an information governance lead or whatever you want to call them, how do they work together? So do they have regular meetings? Do you have workshops? Do you just sit down on a Monday morning over a cup of coffee because there's only 2 or 3 of you and discuss to make sure that you've not had any phishing emails, the router's working properly, those sorts of things. So we expect you to explain to us how you manage and implement at a high level, not very specifically, how you manage data protection within your organisation. Breaking this down further, we mentioned physical. So when we say physical, we're looking at the physical access to the buildings in which you're going to hold the data. So that means, does it have locks on it? Does it have alarms? How do you get into the building? How do visitors get into the building? Can visitors get into the building? So you've got to try and explain to us, because that won't be listed in the majority of your policies and procedures, which we'll come on to later. So you need to explain to us how your data will be, how the data that you're going to collect on our behalf or we're going to pass to you is going to be kept physically secure. Okay, personnel and procedural, these kind of work together. So we're looking at things at how often, what training is provided to staff and how often do they get that training. So we're not looking for someone to say, well, they get training when they join us and then that's it. We'll send out an e-bulletin every now and again if anything changes with the law, because people forget they have responsibilities. So you need to make sure that the training is done on a regular basis, either annually or biannually as a minimum. You also have to consider if they don't pass, is it a pass or fail situation? Usually it should be, because you've got to try and gauge that the individuals understood what the training has provided to them. So if they don't pass, what happens? So if you've done an IT, so if you've got an online-based training function, if they don't pass it, or they don't pass it a number of times, what happens? Do they get more intensive training? Would you speak to them and find out what they're having problems with and struggling with? So it's those sorts of things that we would look to identify there. Outside of the training, how are they provided with details of the policies and procedures that you have in place? Do your staff know that they're there? Are they told to read them? Is the key thing, because it's okay having the greatest policy and procedures in the world, but if no one's reading them, or they're not readable in respect of easy to read, or something that they can refer directly to a point they need to clarify on, how do they support the staff? Because that's the key thing. Your policies and your procedures are meant to support the staff and enable them to carry out the job safely and securely on your behalf. So how is that done? Do you remind staff to check the policies and procedures at staff meetings or e-bulletins or anything of the like, or even at team meetings? How do you deal with making sure people keep up to date and understand that your staff have direct responsibilities in relation to the information that they're using about the people they work with? And even if you only are a small organisation, you should still be aware of the agreed ways to support individual rights. So even if there's only half a dozen of you, you still have that responsibility, because you would have that expectation. If you went to an organisation and you gave them personal information about you, whether it's your name and address, medical information, anything like that, you would expect them to keep it safe and secure. So that expectation falls at your organisation's door as well. And your staff should be aware that they carry that responsibility, as they would expect any other organisation to carry that responsibility, never mind the fact that there is a legislative reason to do it. So when we're looking at these technical controls, we're looking at your system configuration, network security, assurance and monitoring, and verifying identity and user access privileges. So we're not looking for specific details of system configuration. So when you're looking at how your IT kit's put together, or the aspects of your routers, we're not looking for the intricate details, but you should explain where your firewalls are set. Do you use encrypted servers? If it is it FIPS or similar compliant? Do you change your passwords on new equipment? These are all standard things that are not going to upset the security of your system with it being known out there. However, if we don't know that you do all these things, we don't know your systems are secure. What processes are in place to assure network security? Do you have penetration testing? Do you review your logs? And what monitoring is in place and how often? Excuse me. And also, when you're looking at people's access to your systems, what are the processes for obtaining and revoking the rights to the system or your networks? So if you have a new joiner, how do you know what parts of your network they will need access to? Then if they move within your organization, do they get those user rights removed and new ones given to them for the area they're working in? Or do they just keep getting new ones and new ones? Because realistically, they shouldn't have access to data that they don't need to have access to. So if they move from one area to another, if they don't need access to the previous area, they should have their user access amended. So what is the process for doing that? And where is that in your policy and procedural documents? You're also looking at higher privileges as well, like the staff that look at system configuration. So they will have very, very high level privileges, which means that they can do a lot to your network. You know, they can extract a lot of data. They're the ones that could open up areas and ports to enable external access into your system. So what is it that they have to do to get this special additional privilege to do those sorts of things? So if that's undertaken at a high level and has to be done by a director of some sort, that's what you would look to list, that process to enable, or highlight it in your procedural document as to what the procedure is to get that high level privilege. If you're contracting out services, So if you outsource your network processes, so all those things that have just gone through, like your network security, your monitoring, your access privileges, all those sorts of things, that's fine. You know, a lot of people do. But your provider should then be answering those questions for you, because obviously you won't be able to provide, or you probably won't, I should say, not definitely, but you probably won't be able to provide the level of detail that I've highlighted in that previous slide. So go to your provider. They should be able to issue you with documents or responses that will support your answer to that tender question. And make sure that you explain that this is the case in your answer. So tell us that you outsource these services, you know, your network's outsourced and they host it, all those sorts of things. And as a consequence of this, organisation ABC Hosting Limited had provided you with this information about the security in relation to these questions, and then put the answers in there. So don't think that if you're not an IT specialist, you're forced to answer those questions. If you're fortunate enough to have an IT specialist in your organisation that does all these things for you, that's great. If you're not, ask the specialist. Don't suffer through and potentially fail at a point that isn't your specialism. You do also have to remember that your contracts will have to be GDPR compliant. So we would expect you to say, if you're outsourcing the hosting of your network or your systems, and you're working with these organizations, that your contracts are GDPR compliant in relation to the requirements of data processing. So obviously the General Data Protection Regulation specifies the clauses that processors must have in their contracts with data controllers. So the people that commission those services have to have specified contract clauses. So you must provide an assurance that if you are contracting out those services, you've made sure that your contracts with these people are GDPR compliant. And then the final aspect of this question is in relation to subcontractors. So what processes do you have in place to make subcontractors are going to be as diligent as you are? Because obviously if they're taking on aspects of the service that we've contracted you to deliver, we would expect you to make sure that those organizations can follow the requirements of your tender question. You know, so all these great answers that you'll have given us to explain the security and the high level, we would expect you to have that level of assurance with any of the subcontractors you use. So do they provide you with copies of their policies and procedures? Are you assured that they can do all these things in a safe and secure way, just like you've had to assure the GMCA? So that's something that we would look to identify as well, that you would, you know, briefly explain that you have similar processes to make sure the subcontractors are diligent, and what those processes are, whether it's audits, review of policies and procedures, additional contractual clauses, whatever your organisation puts in place with subcontractors. Just explain what it is in the question. So a couple of considerations when you're answering the written aspect of the question. You do have limited words because there's a word count a part of that question. So there is no need to tell us that you take your data protection responsibilities seriously. I've seen that on a number of responses. Organisations will spend a paragraph, so you may be looking at 15 to 20 words of a limited word count explaining that they take their data protection responsibilities seriously. We all have to do that, and the answers that you're going to give me in the rest of the question will confirm that you do that. So you're better off using those additional 20 words to explain your security precautions or anything else specific to the question, more than just giving us a general introduction, because we're not scoring your general introduction, but we will be scoring the rest of your response. Headings and bullet points are really good ways to bring attention to the points of the question. So if there are specific aspects, i.e. you have a heading, network security, and then bullet point how your security functions, you won't get penalised for the space you use, but it makes it easier to read. You're only getting, you only got a word count, not a space count. So use the space to make it more readable and easier to score. And it also means it's easier for you to review. Have you answered all the question? have you put in all the points you wanted to raise, and make sure you've communicated your answer properly to us. Also consider, do the words that you use, the information that you're going to give us as part of this process, do they add anything extra? So your policy will tell us your organizational approach to how you do something, and your procedure will give you instruction. So use the written response and the questions as an opportunity to expand on this and explain that, this policy is used frequently, or anything that would give us more insight into the actual operational workings of your organization. So does it add extra to the policy documentation or the procedural documentation that you've attached? Do you need to provide an explanation? If you don't have Cyber Essentials Plus, why not? So it does ask about Cyber Essentials and ISO. If you don't have those things, provide an explanation. Are you aligned to it? Are you going to get a certification date? Just let us know what's happening. If you just put no, then it doesn't really help. Or if you just put something and hope we'll read into it, well, we're not going to. We can only score you on what's on the paper, because that makes it an equal opportunity there. So give us a bit of an explanation. Use those additional words that you've saved by not explaining about your data protection responsibilities to expand on an explanation. Like I said there, if you're a small organization, try and use that to your advantage. That if you need to roll out any additional training, you've had experience of doing this quickly when you've done other tenders, or you have very strong controls on how personal data is used because you're such a small team and you work so closely together. So there can be advantages in being a smaller organization. Explain that to us. Explain how it works, and that can always go in your benefit. We will always interpret that positively if you explain something to us. One of the key things is, does the policy that you're going to provide support your answer that you've put in the question? So we do ask you as part of the question to reference the policy pages or the procedural document that formalize your approach. If you don't have a policy or a procedure that supports that part of the answer, then maybe you need to look at doing it. Because I've had a number of responses where we've asked for maybe a retention policy or a subject access request policy or procedure, and we get tagged as the policy pages of the IT security policy, and it says the documentation will be kept as long as necessary, and that's your retention policy or your retention process. Well, it isn't, because you need to look at what a retention policy is, but that isn't a retention. It doesn't give me any idea of how long you're keeping the data for. So if you don't have something that will explicitly fit with what you're being asked about, maybe you need to address that. If you're a bigger organization, maybe that's something you need to take to the board. If you're a smaller organization, maybe you can react to it a lot quicker and ensure that you can put those additional documents in place so you can highlight them within your response. So there are just a few things that are worth considering when you're answering the question. So I've talked about what we expect. So to illustrate it, I thought it would be useful to give examples of the sorts of responses we would look to expect in some of them. Now, this isn't an explicit, this isn't a cut and paste. This is an idea of flavour, and this doesn't cover all the questions, but this is to illustrate to you how we would look to score and how we would look to what sort of responses we would look to have. So as you can see, as I mentioned previously, we have a heading, which enables you then to set out what are the answers that you're going to give me as part of that question. So each aspect of that question, break it down into a heading, which enables you to make sure you've covered all the points. Because if you don't answer part of the question, you're going to get marked down for that. So consider that you're going to answer the full question. As I said there, this is the physical controls aspect. So Entries via a manned reception area with sign-in, sign-out process. Visitors are accompanied. Data is kept in locked cabinets, and all buildings are alarmed and security cameras are monitored off-site. So that gives me a good idea that your building is as secure as you're trying to make it. So quick explanation there about the physical access. Staff data protection training. An explanation there, they're given mandatory training within 2 weeks. 100% of staff have done training in the last 12 months and it's refreshed annually. So you've told me there that everyone in the last 12 months has passed it, which is good, and that you do the same thing annually. So whether or not you've joined, you will be given additional training. And as we said, how do you work with the people who don't pass? Manager works with staff that do not pass after 3 attempts, and a copy of the training is attached, which is always, if you don't have it, that's fine. But obviously, if you can illustrate the quality of your training, why not? Doesn't take any words up. It's an additional document, and if it's there and you have access to it, why not provide it? Because that's just another explanation of how you're taking your responsibilities seriously. As we've said there, looking at the policies and procedures aspect, all staff have got to read the policies and procedures within 2 weeks of starting, confirm that they've done it in writing. Whoops. There we go. Yeah, confirm that they've done it within 2 weeks. Any changes to those policies and procedures are circulated by email. All the policies are available in a shared policy folder, and a copy of the training on the policies is attached. There you go. So that's an explanation of how you make sure that the policies and procedures are accessed and used by staff. If you want to go into more depth, that's always appreciated. But as a minimum, you're looking to try and explain that to us. System configuration. Oh, sorry, that's a smaller one. Sorry, someone's not on mute. So if you could go on mute, that would be really helpful. Thanks. So carrying on with the larger organisation, secure system configuration and network security. So that highlights the pages of the information security policy that would support this. It adds to it by saying risk assessments are carried out on each network to make sure that you've identified any information security risks. So that adds to it. You identify that the servers are FIPS encrypted, and all mobile devices have whatever encryption software before you issue them out. All standard passwords are changed, and you have a change management process and a change approval board. So that's just a very high level. That's not everything we would expect to see, but that's a high level flavour of how you can answer that question. Looking at system assurance and monitoring, use proprietary management systems, centralized management and networking equipment, and you have a backup solution. So there is nothing there that would enable me to hack into your system or your network, or could be of risk to your organization, because I have previously, many years ago, had organizations that have sent through the tender question and refused to answer this because it would affect the security of their network. Well, you can see that it's not an issue. We're not asking for the port numbers. We're not asking for any passwords or the specific types of routers that you're using. We are asking for this sort of thing to assure us that you understand what your responsibilities are and that you're doing it appropriately. And obviously it references there about the monitoring, penetration and assessment tests. Verifying user ID and privileges. There's an explanation there. So subject to role-based permissions to ensure that staff can only access data they're entitled to. The help desk, they're responsible for allocating and revoking these permissions. And you tell me where that actual process is. So that aspect of the IT security process should have the instructions for, say, the manager or the line manager or senior manager, what they would do to enable them to either A, get access to another role base, or B, revoke them. The privilege access, as it says there, is limited to necessary staff. They're reviewed 6 monthly and are approved by the director of IT and the head of IT. So, excuse me, it's a two-tier sign-off. So it can't just be allocated by an individual. So if the head of IT wanted to give himself the privileges, he couldn't. Likewise, if the director of IT wanted to do it themselves, they couldn't. It has to go together. All the access is monitored and audits are undertaken. And then, as it explains there, there's more details on those relevant pages of the process. Malware prevention, who's responsible for the installation and maintenance of anti-malware software, the configuration of firewalls and gateways, and making sure that IT support department have adequate technical training. And you're aware of the changing malware threat environment, and you've subscribed to appropriate alert services, so you can tell when the latest version of whatever is going live, or someone has succumbed to it elsewhere. So when you're looking at subcontractors, you made aware, subcontractors made aware during implementation meetings. You undertake due diligence checks on prospective subcontractors to make sure that they can do all the information governance standards. They have to do GDPR training and security training and refresher training, and all contractors have GDPR compliant contracts. And obviously any data is held within the UK. So that's just an example of a response to that aspect of the question. So that was a larger organisation. This is for a smaller organisation that may not have all the facilities in relation to directors of IT, etc. So it's a very similar response in how they get in the physical controls. So it's locked, it's shuttered. Only 3 people have the keys in the alarm code. You've got to use a buzzer if you want to get in, so the front door's locked, and people are met at the front door and accompanied through, and subsequently the building's alarmed and security cameras. So very similar response, but it just highlights that there's only 3 people have the keys and the alarm code. You know, so you're limiting that it's senior members of staff that are going to have that access. Data protection training, they only have 6 members of staff. You're giving mandatory training. You've all done training in the last 12 months, which is refreshed annually. So it's pretty much the same as a larger organisation, because whether you have 6 staff or 60 staff, you should still have training, because people do need to be reminded of responsibilities. So that we would still expect that level of explanation. All staff must read the organisational policies. Sorry, are we all on mute? Because I can hear people breathing. All staff must read the organisational policies, and all policies are available in a policy folder, and a copy of the training is attached. So people, you may not have an intranet, you know, if you're a small organisation, but you can have a shared folder on your network or somewhere where people can access those documents that they need to refer to. As I said before, you can outsource your network. So in this situation, it's outsourced to a consultant, and the configuration and security are in the highlighted aspects of the security specification. So this organisation's gone to their consultants and asked them for the answers. And what they've done is they've come up with a security specification and highlighted the bits that they think would answer the question. And that's perfectly acceptable. You've highlighted there that mobile devices have encryption software before being issued out. Just to clarify, mobile devices would include laptops as well as phones. So if your phones have encryption, that's fine. But obviously, if people are getting access to emails, work emails on a personal device, that creates an issue. So obviously, if they lose that device and someone finds it, they can access your work emails. So you do have to consider some aspects of the mobile devices there, and that's why we're looking at encryption software or even mobile device management software should be on those phones. And they've attached a copy of the processes there. And there's the assurance that the contract with Pink Elephant requires that networks hosted in the UK, and they've confirmed that is the case, and they've attached a copy of the contract for confirmation. Does no harm, gives that additional level of assurance that you've been told it's GDPR compliant, and that's what you've passed on to us. System assurance and monitoring. So as part of their service specification, Pink Elephant do all their monitoring, and they provide a process to the person undertaking this tender to explain what they do, and they've attached that, and that's fine. That's fine. Likewise with the details of penetration testing and control assessment tests. All of that is fine. Similar response in relation to user access privileges. There's still a role-based permissions, so they can only access the data that they're entitled to. There is going to be an IT manager or someone who's responsible for either asking Pink Elephant to allocate these permissions. So I would expect to have an IT security process to request that access. So you can't just have Pete turning up on day one and Pete saying, all right, can I have access to this system? Yeah, of course you can. This should be someone who should be challenging why. So whether it's their manager or one of the owners of the business or whoever, you need to make sure that people are only gaining access to the information that they need. Privileged access is only to necessary staff, as you would expect. They've got to be approved by the IT and HR manager, and any access is monitored by Pink Elephants. So that might be to get into the back end of the network to pull off reporting. It may be that you need access to the whole of the system to pull off specific reports. So that would be still classed as privileged access, because you would have access to a lot of information that wouldn't just be restricted to your own organisation. So that is listed and monitored by Pink Elephant. Malware prevention, once again, that's all undertaken by the contractors, and confirms that their contract confirms that they will be suitably trained to deliver those things. So those are the sorts of responses we would look for a smaller organisation. And likewise, the subcontractor selection, that you are still going to do all those things. And this is going to be very similar to a larger organisation, because we would expect you to check that any subcontractors you use comply with data protection requirements, GDPR. If someone reviews their security compliance, GDPR contracts are going to be in place, compliant contracts are going to be in place, and that if they hold any data, it's within the UK. So there isn't a massive leap in a lot of the responses. It's just the level of who's going to provide the answer. So whether it's your IT security manager or it's your consultant, someone is still going to answer the question, and it just depends on who that is and potentially the level of complexity that will come back with it. So then when we're looking at the additional documents that we do ask you to attach as part of the process, make sure that they cover what is required. We do read through them, so don't be surprised that we will pick you up on aspects of your policies if we don't think that a particular policy you provided covers what you've claimed it will do. So if all you're going to send through is a paragraph in your finance policy that says you keep your financial records for 7 years, and you're saying that's your retention policy, well, it isn't, because you've got data that you'll be retaining in relation to staff potentially. HR records, you've got the people you work with, you're going to have individual records on them. So you will need a retention document or a schedule or something that says this is how long we keep our data for. Whether you call it a policy, whether you call it a schedule, whether you call it a process, whether it's 1 page, 2 pages, or half a dozen pages, you will still have something that should instruct your staff how long to keep data for, because ultimately this is an instruction. The documentation and your policies that you issue are instructions to your staff. So if someone doesn't know how long they should keep a client record for, they should be able to go to your retention policy and identify how long it should be kept for. If they get a subject access request, they should be able to look at the procedure and know exactly what to do if they don't know off the top of their head. So your documentation, as well as your policies, should be giving instructions to staff. Make sure you either list the relevant pages or highlight the parts of the page that are applicable. Or if it is a whole document, so it is your whole retention schedule, just state the whole retention schedule. This aspect is very relevant if you have very large documents. So I have seen data protection policies that cover everything. It's not great because obviously if I'm a member of staff and I've got to flick through a 60-page data protection policy to find out how to respond to a subject access request or how long I'm meant to keep a client file for, it's going to be hard work and I may not do it as often as I should do. But if you do have very large documents and they're not split up, you need to highlight them for us because we don't have the capacity to read through a 60-page document to find the answer that we're looking for. If your documents state in them that so if you have policies that state we will review this annually, make sure you do review it annually. So I've received documentation that says this policy will be reviewed by the board annually, and last review date was 2017. You know, so you failed at the first hurdle, it's not being reviewed. So that just implies that you're potentially not taking it seriously. Or the other alternative is you have reviewed it, but you've not changed your policy document, which means how is it appropriately reviewed? So do consider these things. If you have a data protection policy referring to the 1998 Data Protection Act, that's usually a pretty good indicator that you're not taking your reviews as seriously as you should be doing. So it's these sorts of things that you need to bear in mind. If you are reviewing documents, please make sure they are reviewed appropriately and are updated in relation to legal requirements. The other thing is if parts of your policy or your procedures refer to other documents, include them as well. So if it turns around and you said, you know, as part of the policy, the user access privileges, you must complete the form in HR policy on page 27, in the HR policy on page 27, and send us a copy of the HR policy, because the fact that you may have a user access policy that refers to your HR policy means we need both, not just half the answer, because obviously that we don't then know what that access request looks like or where that access request is meant to go. So include other documents that the ones that you're initially going to supply refer to. Can you please make sure that you provide copies of the documents to enable you to identify the relevant parts? But if you are successful, we also want to keep them, because obviously if you're on this framework, we're going to use them for DPAs, so data protection impact assessments, to prove that the commissioned organisation who we will work with has all this in place. If you don't send them to us, if you're successful, we're just going to ask you for them anyway, or we may just fail you because we've asked for all your policy documents and you've not provided them. If you just send us links to bits of your website, then that's not what we've asked for. So don't send us links to websites, because inevitably you're not going to have everything on a website, because we won't be able to get into an intranet because we're an external organisation. And if you have a front-facing page of a website that has relevant policies on it, my experience is it doesn't have everything on it that you've referred to. So then we're kind of stuck saying, well, you've not given us what we've asked for, so we'll fail you on it. So if it is that we've asked for a privacy notice and you only have it as a web page, that's fine. Cut and paste the web page into a Word document or put it in a PDF and send that across and say, this is the privacy notice on our web page and here's the URL or the web address you can find it at. So please send us what we ask for, which is copies of the documentations, Word, PDF documents. I referenced the privacy notice. Make sure the privacy notice that we ask you for covers the services that you provide. So a copy of your website privacy notice explaining about cookies, and that's it, isn't going to be the one that we want. We want the one that you should be issuing to the service users to say, when we work with you, this is the data we collect on the basis that we collect it. And going ahead with that, make sure your privacy notice covers the GDPR requirements and the ICO guidance on privacy notice content. The Information Commissioner's Office guidance sets out headings that replicate what the GDPR says should be in a privacy notice. So there is no reason why you can't go through the guidance on the ICO's website to make sure that your privacy notice covers everything. Because to be honest, we have a checklist and that's what we do. So if you're not covering everything or you've not sent us an appropriate privacy notice, that's not good. If your policies or procedures are meant to give instructions to staff, make sure that they do. So for subject access requests, as an example, does your policy or procedural instruct your staff on the steps to take and who to speak to if they need to speak to, or who to refer it, or where to log it? All those sorts of things that are important. Does that instruct your staff on how to do it? Or do you have a specific member of staff that does it? They would still apply to them, because obviously if that specific member of staff is off sick, as is very relevant right now, then they're going to have to, someone's going to have to take up the mantle. So you're going to need a step-by-step process. Your policies and procedures don't have to be enormous documents. Sometimes a process is better off being 1 or 2 sides of bullet points, because that's, like I've said before, that's more likely to get read. If I want to know how to do a subject access request and you can give me a dozen step-by-step processes, step-by-step instructions, I'm much more likely to follow that than having to go through a 23-page manual. There is no expectation that a policy or a procedure has to be a certain size. What we look at when we're reviewing these things is quality over quantity. So just because it's 1 page, if it does the job, it does the job. Any certificates that are sent over, make sure that they are in date. And if they do refer to another organisation, sorry, someone's on mute there, thanks. If they do refer to another organisation, can you explain why they do in your written response? Because sending a random ISO 27001 certificate for an organisation that's not referred to in any other part of your response is not going to serve any purpose for anybody. So like I said, explanations are always valued. And like we've reiterated in the responses, if you contract out any of your network hosting or IT support, ask those organisations for the policies to support your response. So if you're saying, these guys are all appropriately trained, well, have they got a training policy that they could let you have? Because you're forming part of a tender and you're paying for their services. Just make sure that they either confirm or highlight the relevant pages to you if they send through a full document. Always make sure that your contracts for any of these outsourced services are GDPR compliant. And there is the potential, obviously, with the upcoming Brexit implications, that you may have to consult the ICO or the gov.uk websites regarding these contracts if your providers haven't already contacted you to discuss any changes. So what I've been through might seem a lot of work if you're starting from scratch and have never done a tender response before. But these data protection requirement tender questions are not going to go away. So why not use your initial response as a template for any future tenders? If you put the effort into this response and it covers all the points that it needs to, and it's gone through the same way, as headings and bullet points, like we've explained earlier on in the training. If you've got that, keep it. So then if you get a similar question, if there've been no changes, you've got a well-prepared question that you can just review and reuse. Or if you need to tweak it, because the question you're answering doesn't need to know all of that, then you're not starting from a blank slate as you have done to begin with. Also, if you get feedback as part of the tender process where your question wasn't as explicit or as insightful as it should be, take that into account, go away and try and update the question whilst you've got time and you're not having to comply with a tender deadline. Make sure you update it to take into account that feedback, because it will only strengthen your response. And like we said there, keep all that documentation together in one place so you don't have to go looking for all your policies and all your processes and asking contractors for copies of documents every single time that you want to apply for a tender, or every single time that you're asked for it as part of a data protection impact assessment. All you need to do is drop an email to your contractors and say, have there been any changes to the policies you sent us on such and such a date? If they have, can we have an updated version? Or if you know what you've changed internally, just substitute the new ones out. We're not asking you to do as part of this questioning anything other than evidence your compliance with data protection, the data protection legislation, which, as I said right at the start of this, as a commissioner, the GMCA has a responsibility to ensure that whoever we spend our money with does comply with data protection legislation, because A, we're spending public funds, but B, we're asking you to engage with members of the public, and in some circumstances, there may be vulnerable members of the public as well. So we want to feel assured that we are working with organisations that take their responsibilities as seriously as we do. And that is why we ask you to evidence it in this way. That's an aside from the fact that it's a general data protection responsibility in relation to processes, and if you're joint data controllers, it's the same responsibility as well. So apart from all that, we have a moral obligation as well. If you do have any gaps, so like I said, you don't have a policy or a procedure that covers specific aspects that we've asked you to evidence in the question, then use it as an opportunity to put that in place. It's only going to help your organisation. By not having it, you're probably doing your service users and your staff a disservice, because you're not as compliant as you should be, or your staff aren't as well instructed as they should be. So this may be an opportunity to put those things in place, improve your chances at a tender win, but also strengthen your organisational response to data protection. And ultimately, as I've already said, the residents of Greater Manchester have an expectation that their information will be used appropriately. This process is meant to support that expectation. So, we all have that expectation that organisations that we work with will look after our information. Obviously, the ICO will fine or investigate those that don't do it properly, as has been shown. But we have to provide residents that we are trying the best we can. And that's what this process is trying to do. And that's it. That's the end of the presentation. So as we've said at the beginning, we are going to go through the questions that have been in the chat, and we'll create that as a document to upload to the chest. And hopefully you'll have liked multiple ones, so we can highlight the ones which are most important. So I hope that was okay for everybody, and I hope it gives an insight into and some assistance to you in relation to the answering of the information governance questions on the tender for the flexible procurement framework, and for any other IG questions that you'll get as part of a tender with the GMCA. Thank you for coming today.